the Karakia.
Welcome, everybody. Ka ururu mai a hau ora, a hau kaha, a hau maia. Ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki waho, rire hau, pai maariai. Bring forth the wind of health, the winds of strength, the winds of courage, from above, from below, from within, from without, for goodwill and eternal peace.
Okay, thank you, Bev, for that Karakia. I will now introduce Nandita briefly, and she'll make a presentation for close to an hour, and then we'll have our usual Q&A. In the meantime, I would remind everyone to please mute themselves in order for your sounds not to interfere with the presentation. And to save bandwidth and power, I suggest you also turn your video off until such time as the Q&A begins. So we're very fortunate to have Nandita Bajaj with us this evening. She is an educator, a researcher, an activist, and a frequent presenter to media, not just in Canada where she's based, but internationally. One of the things that has intrigued me about Nandita's work is how important it is and how she treats it so sensitively and intelligently, despite the topic being one that is highly emotional for many people. She has a way of dealing with that, I think, in a way that we can all learn from. But before she begins, I have to ask her, because one of her distinctions is having a degree in aerospace engineering. And I would like to know how you got, Nandita, from aerospace engineering to overconsumption and overpopulation.
Thank you, Jack, for your nice comments about my work and for having me here. And thanks everyone for joining today. I'm so excited to be able to speak with you all. So I started my career as an aerospace engineer. I was, when I was in high school, I was quite taken by airplanes and spacecraft and just space exploration, the idea of looking beyond Earth and trying to understand deep time. It's quite ironic because today I am very much against air travel, and I have my sincere doubts about technological fundamentalism as far as it's looking at, exploiting other planets, as many of the tech billionaires are talking about. So I've had a complete 180 from when I started, but I really was, first I wanted to become a pilot, and I took some flight lessons for a couple of years and decided at the end of it that I actually wanted to work with airplanes. I was quite good at math and science, so I decided to go into engineering. But interestingly, I had grown up in India, which is the most populous country today. And when I was born 43 years ago, it was the second most populous country. So overpopulation has always been part of my identity, part of my upbringing, a visceral experience for me. So it's never something that has been part of a scientific or ideological debate. It was a reality in which I grew up. And, so as I was studying aerospace engineering, I started to become more interested also in environmentalism. And environmentalism is very much linked to population. And at the time I was living in Canada, where, we live quite good lives, sometimes even luxuriously good lives. And so I was for me, it was a juxtaposition of where I was born and where I was living and the kind of work I was doing. All these epiphanies were not happening at the same time. It's taken me, 20 years of evolution to realize where I want to be. But after I worked in aerospace engineering, I worked as a high school science, physics, and math teacher for about 10 years and realized that some of the things that we were not talking about in high school, especially in science and physics, were ecological limits. It was very much my experience of studying engineering and teaching it was very much about techno-optimist solutions to global issues. And nowhere did I see anything based in ecological wisdom or nature-based solutions in what I was expected to teach and what I was taught. And so over the course of the last 5-6 years, I've switched careers again. I went back to graduate school to study the links between overpopulation, overconsumption, ecological overshoot, but also looking at concepts of human supremacy, how humans look at the non-human world as resources for us. And then another topic that was of personal interest, really a personal revelation for me, was the concept of pronatalism, the pressure on people to have children and large families. So all of that combined was kind of happening in the background as I was pursuing these careers. And, I'm at a point right now in my career where I've combined all of my personal passions with my scientific research in this area. And that's where I am today. I'm sorry, it was a bit of a long-winded response, but it ties in perfectly to everything I'll talk about today.
Lovely. So just go right ahead. And you've got the control of the screen whenever you wish to use it.
Excellent. And I'll try to keep the presentation to 45 minutes just so we can talk together more. That's always more fun. Okay, so here we are.
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent. Thank you. So the topic today is confronting growthism and pronatalism for social and ecological justice, though in simpler terms, I would say just confronting, ecological overshoot and what's that doing to both people, animals, and the planet. The outline for today I'll cover is the concept of human expansionism, what we have done as one species to the rest of the planet, why one part of human expansionism, which is the population part, gets sidelined in a lot of current environmental and social justice and reproductive justice discourses. And one aspect of that would be, how do we confront population denial and population shaming, which are part of population taboo? And then finally, how do we reverse our state of ecological overshoot voluntarily, because we know that Earth will reverse that in natural ways. If we don't do it, in fact, it's happening as we speak. So many of you will be familiar with this graph, which is just a very brief history of humanity over the last 12,000 years since the last ice age. Homo sapiens have been around for a lot longer, 250 to 300,000 years. as gatherer-hunter societies, and for most of our time, we were living with a population of under 1 million. Over the last 10,000 years, we've had but several major things happened, and I'm going to skip over many of those just to give broad brush coverage of some of these. So we had the agricultural revolution happened about 10,000 years ago, which is where we began domesticating animals and plants. And within the next few thousand years, we also had kind of the rise of states and empires, along with which came a lot of social hierarchies, classism, sexism, etc. And patriarchy was a huge part of that era. In order to grow the empires and states, men and women had to be separated into roles, primarily into childbearing roles for women and soldiering for men, both to grow the population, to grow the strength of the empires, but also to protect the empires through militarism. And jumping ahead, a lot of different things have happened within here: religion, scientific revolution, but we're going to jump right to Industrial Revolution, which happened only about 200 years ago. And at that time, our population had reached 1 billion in about 1800. So it took us 250 to 300,000 years to reach the first billion. And because of access to cheap fossil fuel energy, we grew from 1 billion to 8 billion in just 200 years. I'm going to play a little clip by one of the great educators and scientists, ecologist, Dr. William Rees, who is an expert on the concept of ecological overshoot. And he gives a context about what this growth in the last 200 years represents.
I think it's really interesting to look historically at this whole question of growth, because for all intents and purposes, there was none for 250,000 years. In just the last 200 years, we've seen more change than in the previous entire history of human beings. Only 10 generations of human beings out of thousands have experienced this phenomenon of growth. Growth in population, growth in technology, in sufficient quantity so that they would notice in the course of their lifetimes. And so it's really a very, very recent phenomenon. But because all of us alive today and for the past few generations have been embedded within this growth dynamic, we take it to be the norm. And therefore, we project ourselves into the future as if it can continue forever. But the fact is that this is the single most abnormal period in human history. It's completely unprecedented, never occurred before, and can never occur again.
And so from that, we go on to see what ecological overshoot has actually done to our planet in the last 200 years. So as our population grew by a factor of 8, our consumption grew by a factor of 100. And we are currently demanding 75% more from Earth than Earth can sustainably provide in terms of resources, but also Earth's ability to accumulate our wastes. And so the population consumption dichotomy that often gets brought up, is it population, is it consumption, often gets boiled down to this: the fact that there is a grossly inequitable distribution of resources globally. And folks like us in the US, Canada, richer countries are consuming far, far, far more on average than an average citizen in some of the poorer countries, say India, where I was born and raised. And so that inevitably, and really truly is gross unfairness in terms of how things have been distributed. And many of those things are a result of imperialism, extractive capitalist policies, pushing out waste to poor countries and taking a lot of their resources to help us flourish in the richer countries. So it's a very, very important point to keep in mind. But often what happens within ecological sustainability debates is people just want to stop the conversation here and say, it's only consumption, it's only the rich, population doesn't matter, because look at India, it's 1.4 billion people, but on average, they're consuming so much less. What a lot of folks don't realize is population and consumption go hand in hand. Even at a really low level of consumption, you multiply that really small number with a really large number of people, as grossly inequitable as that is, it results in a large impact. But that's not where the conversation should stop. I'll show you why this is a false dichotomy, is because there's also a built-in expectation when people say it's just the rich, not the poor, who are the problem. There's a built-in expectation that the poor do not deserve to raise their standard of living, that people in India, currently at 1.4 billion, will simply continue to maintain a 0.8 ecological footprint per capita, which you can argue is even more grossly unfair to have that expectation. This is some of the statements, for example, that represent this kind of population denial. So Union of Concerned Scientists on their website has a statement saying, we're sometimes asked, isn't population growth driving climate change? But that's the wrong question, and it can lead to dangerous answers. They don't explain what dangerous means here. We are expected to extrapolate what that means. And also, another aspect of ecological overshoot is that climate change is only one part of ecological overshoot. Yes, it's getting most of the attention, but there are a lot of things happening in the world: toxification of land, air, water, biodiversity loss, species extinction, global resource scarcity. All of those are aspects of ecological overshoot. Climate change is not the only issue, but even within climate change, this is the wrong claim. And I'll show you in a second why. Another really popular scientist, Katharine Hayhoe, who is the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, recently said, there are 8 billion people on Earth, but that isn't causing climate change, scientists say. Well, if people aren't causing it, I don't think it's the cockroaches doing it. People who claim that population growth is the big environmental issue are shifting the blame from the rich to the poor. A very popular Guardian columnist, George Monbiot. Now, it's really important to understand and sympathize with where this denial comes from, why people are so nervous to talk about population, to the detriment of the very people that they claim to be protecting in making these kinds of statements. So first of all those people were talking about climate change, and that population does not affect climate change, only consumption does. Well, the IPCC, currently the largest intergovernmental body on climate change, says GDP per capita and population growth are the strongest drivers of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel consumption in the last decade. So that statement doesn't even hold true that climate change is just caused by the consumption of rich people. The second thing that's missing, so it's not just the IPCC, there are other bodies that say it, but the second thing that's missing in this debate is the global middle class, that is the number of rich people in the world. They're not just limited to what we call the rich countries. Country where I live now and the countries where you are, the global middle class is the fastest rising demographic group in the world right now. Almost 90% of the next billion people who will be entering the middle class this decade by 2030 will be from Asia, from India and China, mainly, and then some from the rest of Asia. Those are not considered rich countries, and yet that number is equivalent to the population of the United States right now. So that's 2 United States worth of people being added to a level of standard of a United States citizen. So I think it gets really fruitless when we start looking at countries, global north, global south, etc. So, of course, there are a lot of other bodies that have raised concerns about population driving a lot of other issues like biodiversity loss, like species extinction, toxification, ocean acidification, and many more issues. And these institutions, the United States and IPCC, they're quite conservative institutions. They have their own issues, as I will present later on. They are themselves growth biased, but even they are raising the alarm that population growth is an issue. So why is it so difficult to talk about population? In our work, we focus on 3 things. There are many reasons. People don't want to talk about it, but we boiled it down to 3 things: human supremacy, past policies, and pronatalism. So human supremacy, according to Dr. Eileen Christ, who is one of our board directors, is a worldview that esteems the human as a distinguished entity that is superior to all other life forms and is entitled to use them and the places they live. So basically looking at the biophysical basis of our own existence, which is the rest of life, looking at that as a resource for us to colonize, exploit, and consume. And I'm going to bring back Dr. Rees again. I had just asked him what he thinks human exceptionalism is, and he's just answering that question. This is an interview series that we do, our podcast.
Sure. I think it's really important to emphasize something that you've alluded to here, and that is that human beings are storytellers. We don't live in reality the way other species do. We make up stories, and then we live out of those confections as if they were the real thing. And exceptionalism, the word you used, is one of those stories. So it's a philosophical concept, I suppose, with deep roots in religion, but it subscribes to the belief that human beings are outside of nature. We're not like other organisms. Many people don't like to think of themselves as animals, for example. And once you've developed a story that puts you outside of nature, then clearly you are, I suppose, liberated from the laws of nature, biophysics, physics, and so on and so forth. So here we are, a species that is unique in the world as far as we know, in that it considers itself to be not part of the system of which it is deeply a part. So the story deviates enormously from the reality. And I think that's a major source of many of our problems.
So what has human exceptionalism as an ideology done to the rest of the non-human world? So we see here agriculture and logging. So the reason I bring this up first is because agriculture uses up 50% of the habitable land just to grow food for us. And majority of that land is used for animal agriculture, which is not only really terrible for greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also really inefficient way of growing food. And not only that, it's also a really violent way of making food. Hunting, poaching, and fishing currently threatens 75% of studied animals, whether it's for food, for body parts, for medicinal purposes. Different communities, countries have superstitions around what animal parts can do for our well-being, and that's what ends up happening. And then, of course, the development of sheer infrastructure to continue to help us grow. The industry, transportation, roads, all of those have led to severe degrees of habitat fragmentation. And so you can see here, I showed you earlier that the global middle class is the fastest rising demographic group. And one of the things that happens when you enter the middle class, in addition to you owning a car, to starting to fly, engaging in kind of high consumption activities, is also the rate of consumption of meat and animal products goes up. So you can see since 1970, in the last 50 years, as our population has doubled from 4 billion to 8 billion, meat production and consumption has increased by almost 4 times. And Asia, which I showed is one of the fastest rising middle class demographics, meat consumption grew by a factor of 10. That's also the continent where most of the new factory farms are going to meet the growing demands for animal products. During that same time, in the last 50 years, looking at the studied populations of freshwater species, we have seen an 84% decline in the wild populations, according to the Living Planet Index, and a 68% decline in wildlife populations on land. So that's, again, the same period of time since our population doubled from 4 to 8 billion. And population is working lockstep here with species extinction. So since the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, as our population grew by a factor of 8, in purple, you can see the species extinction rate has gone up in lockstep to that. And the background extinction rate, which is the normal rate without, kind of human interventions, is right here. And current rates of extinction are anywhere from 100 to 1,000 times higher. And I think this graphic probably does the most telling in terms of what we have done to the planet. So 10,000 years ago, when I showed the graph earlier, when we started engaging in the agricultural revolution, we had 99% of the total mammalian weight, total weight of animals, mammals, was 99%. So they were free living wild animals. And we, one of the animals, represented only 1% of that biomass. So 99% and 1% versus today, wildlife has been exterminated down to 4% of the total biomass. And we and the animals that we kill for food, what we call livestock, represent 96% of the total mammalian biomass. So basically, the animals currently that are dominating the planet are the ones that are being killed for food. So those are some shocking statistics in terms of what has the ideology of human supremacy done to the debate. And so anyone who says population numbers don't matter, it's only consumption, is often looking at the issue from a very anthropocentric perspective, where it's just the human beings that matter. And the rest of the non-human world doesn't matter, which is also ecologically naive, because the rest of the world is the basis of our existence. Past policies, I think, is probably the most popular reason why so many people are afraid to talk about population. It's not the right reason, but it's the most popular reason. So when the UN was formed in 1945, and we started looking at demographic concerns with, severe population growth and what that was doing to countries who were unable to keep up with, their development and their social well-being, because population growth was outpacing all of those efforts. There were lots of different conferences that were held by the UN in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, where demographic concerns were front and center. And a lot of countries put in a lot of policies into place to understand why the population was growing so quickly and to help arrest that growth rate. And most of the countries that succeeded were the ones that actually put empowering, rights valuing policies, such as giving women autonomy to decide how many children, if any, do they want to have, and to be able to do that with access to family planning resources. Those policies were absolutely tremendous in terms of reducing the fertility rates. In many countries like Thailand and Costa Rica and Bangladesh and Morocco, you saw population drop, or fertility rates drop, from an average of 6 children per woman to less than 2 in a matter of a decade or 2 decades at most. So within 20 years, imagine the fertility rate going from 6 to under 2. Around that same time, there were several other countries that, let's say, did not use creative imagination and put in policies that actually took away rights. And they were punitive policies that punished people for having too many kids, rather than understanding why were people having too many kids. And examples of that are China's one-child policy, the forced sterilization campaigns in Puerto Rico and in India, and similar policies, within communities that took away rights by forcibly aborting people or sterilizing people to prevent them from having children. Those policies were not the rule, they were the exception. These were the rules. These policies were the rule. But because people got so caught up in the egregious violations of human rights, rightfully, that came with China's one-child policy and forced sterilization campaigns, they assumed that the only reason or the only way to address population growth was through coercion, and that we needed to denounce not only those policies, but also any subject or any discussion of population, and to go as far as denying population as an issue at all. So that was really unfortunate because it was a magnification of something that was not the rule, but the exception. In fact, as you see over, that course of time in the last 50, 60, 70 years, we saw rapid fertility decline in a lot of countries. And many people will say, oh, it's because these countries became industrialized or they started to develop or become economically stable. That is mistaken and largely debunked aspect of what's known as the demographic transition theory, that, when people get rich, they have fewer kids. Well, maybe because they can't afford to have that many kids, but it's not a guarantee that when people have refrigerators and cars, they're going to have fewer kids. In fact, it's autonomy, not economy, that leads to declining fertility rates. And a lot of degrowthers will actually repeat that falsehood, that, a lot of these countries that are high fertility rates, if only they are allowed to grow economically, fertility rates will decline. That is not true. Here we have a study that looked at 156 countries and looking at their fertility decline rate, and found that it was modern contraception access to abortion, access to family planning services, and counseling services that led to fertility decline. It didn't matter whether the GDP of that country increased, decreased, or stayed the same. Fertility declined regardless of the economy. So that brings me to the next part of my presentation, which is a lot of people, when they talk about population policies, they always go to, the efforts to lower birth rates are an egregious violation of reproductive rights. And it's like a blanket statement that's applied without saying, well, which efforts to lower birth rates? If they're coercive efforts to lower birth rates, yes, they are a violation of reproductive rights. But if they are rights-based efforts to lower birth rates, they're actually elevating reproductive rights by giving people, especially women, more autonomy. But what a lot of the same people who argue against population do not realize is that efforts to increase birth rates have, for millennia, been the most pervasive and prevalent form of reproductive control. In fact, it goes, if people want to understand what population control really looks like, or reproductive control looks like, that's the aspect we need to understand, is how many institutions of power benefit from more people and are pushing for more children. Which brings me to the concept of pronatalism, which is my area of research. So pronatalism, just simple definition, is policy or an ideology that is pro-birth. It pushes people to have more children regardless of what they want. So earlier in the graph, where I show the hockey stick, I talked about the rise of empires and states a few thousand years after the agricultural revolution, and the rise of patriarchy through these elite power holders. So here I'm going to play a clip by Angela Saini, who's a journalist who recently wrote this book, The Patriarchs: How Men Came to Rule, where she describes how pronatalism became institutionalized.
The idea of a gender division of labor is actually a relatively recent one. the big turning point comes with the emergence of the first states. That's at least where we can see it in the record very clearly. You can imagine in those very early states, what were the big concerns of the elites who were trying to form those states? Obviously, population must have been very high up that agenda, because if you're creating a society in which you need people to create a surplus for those at the top, in which you need people to be available to defend the state and die for it if necessary, then you need people. They are the number one valuable commodity right throughout history. So, of course, over these thousands of years, you see pressure fall on young women to have as many children as possible, which in hunter-gatherer societies, otherwise they do not do. And also pressure falls on young men to be available to defend the state.
So pronatalism and militarism, which were key features of patriarchy and the rise of these empires and states, are still present today. They just get covered up under, sometimes progressive sounding veneers, but they're very much the same ideologies at play today. So I'll put a definition of pronatalism here, a more modern definition of pronatalism in today's society is the idea that parenthood and raising children should be the central focus of every person's adult life. It is a strong social force and includes a collection of beliefs so embedded that they've come to be seen as true. And in talking about pronatalism, it's important to recognize that it's not challenging parenthood or procreation. What it's challenging is the ideology that pushes people to have children to meet other external demographic goals. Whether it's religion, whether it's corporations, whether it's political power, whether it's cannon fodder for the military, that's the ideology that we're trying to challenge.
All right.
You see, so if people were given true autonomy to decide if and when they want to have children and how many children they want to have, that should be not the decision of the state. That should be a personal decision that should be available to us. So pronatalism shows up in a number of different ways. Cultural pressures, religious pressures, pressures from corporations to grow the economy, pressures from politicians to have more taxpayers, to have a larger military, or to have a larger ethnic population, whether it's a certain tribe or a certain nationality, to preserve what we call, kind of a nativist type of approach or ideology. And cultural pressures can be some of the most pervasive ones, especially those that come from, religious and family pressures combined, where
particular, but it's come from
people, just so you know, Gavin, I can hear you. You're not muted. So cultural pressures are some of the most intense. So people or women who are unable to have children or do not want to have children can experience severe backlash. It could lead to divorce, domestic violence, coerced reproduction, economic marginalization, social ostracization, etc. So a person's value in a community is very much tied to their reproductive capacity and their reproductive ability and how many children they've produced. And that, depends on where you are on the spectrum of being very traditional to very progressive. Here are some examples from recent headlines that show what pronatalism looks like, driven by politicians. So Iran, about 30 years ago, had one of the most incredible family planning policies in the world. In fact, it was one of the countries that was used as an exemplar for how to increase increase reproductive autonomy, how to increase gender equality. And it saw a rapid decline in fertility rates. The current administration is so worried about increased gender equality that, you know, women are actually choosing to have fewer children, that it's trying to reverse reproductive rights and take away the state provision of contraceptives and vasectomies so that people are forced to have children. They don't have a choice. Some other countries like Turkey and Hungary and Russia are offering large bonuses or tax cuts if people produce 3, 4, or 10 children. Because you can see here, the children are property of the state. That's how it's being couched. Japan is blaming women for nation's falling population, saying, well, women have become too liberated. We need to bring them back and put them in their place, and then they'll have more children. I would be remiss if I did not mention the star of the show. If you are following US news, you will have heard of J.D. Vance, who is a US senator. He's the VP nominee for the Republican Party, who has made a name for himself recently by calling people without children childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made. And he takes a shot at some politicians and it's suggesting that only people with children, actually people with children should be given more votes, and people without children shouldn't have the same number of votes because they don't have a stake in the future. We see similar nonsense coming from other politicians. Here we see Turkey, at least 3 children are necessary in each family because our population risks aging. We see Pope Francis talking about people who do not have a child are selfish because they're not producing enough religious followers. We see ethnocentrism through Orban's comments here in Hungary. We will defend Christian culture and will not surrender the country to aliens, meaning immigrants. Instead of just numbers, we want Hungarian children. Migration for us is surrender. Similarly, you see Matt Schlapp in the US, who is saying, you know, we have a population problem, as in we don't have enough people. And he's saying, well, you could fix that by not killing so many millions of your own people through abortion. So if you just ban abortion, we would have all those extra babies that the mothers didn't want. And elite billionaires have their own vested interest in having larger populations. We talked earlier about them wanting to colonize other planets. So they have, you know, their own trumpet going on why declining population is such a bad thing, without recognizing that the population is still growing by this about 80 million people a year. The other people that have a lot to gain from population denial are organizations that are promoters of free market fundamentalism or neoliberalism. Some of these are also libertarian organizations that are quite right-wing, and the same organizations that, if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway,
what sound is this?
Merchants of Doubt, you know, they talked about a lot
Like
of
a sizzling sound. No, it's not from there. Is it in something in the kitchen still?
Can everyone please turn off their audio so it doesn't interfere with Nandita's presentation? Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. So these are the same people, same organizations that put in millions of dollars in funding climate denial. Same organizations that are now trumpeting population denial. These organizations that have done absolutely no work in demography, in reproductive rights, really have no understanding, but are pushing these types of narratives that population or overpopulation is a myth. So we actually had Dr. Naomi Oreskes on our podcast a few months ago, and she talked about these organizations, and I'm just going to play a quick clip.
Why would an organization like the Cato Institute or the Foundation for Economic Education say that overpopulation is a myth? Well, these are organizations whose central activities is to promote libertarian ideology in order to push back against government action in the marketplace. We do know that many of these organizations are heavily, heavily funded by Fortune 500 companies, captains of industries, who stand to benefit from weak government regulation. And so if we say population is a serious issue, in part because of the destruction of biodiversity, the destruction of habitat, pushing up against planetary limits, coerced reproduction of many women across the world, there's a whole set of issues here that invite a conversation about governance, about the role of governments, and also about governance through NGOs, local institutions, etc. And all of these things point to the need for planning, thinking about the future, and figuring out what are appropriate responses. They hate planning because they associate planning with socialism.
So again, you can see how many different organizations and institutional powers rely on population growth and are spreading rhetoric about overpopulation being a myth. And unfortunately, it's our friends and our colleagues on the left who are buying into those narratives without questioning the motives of these institutions. So I'm going to start wrapping up the presentation here. So George Monbiot, the columnist from The Guardian I brought up earlier, he has made lots of comments about population being a myth. And one of his most famous ones is, it's no coincidence that most of those who are obsessed with overpopulation are post-reproductive, wealthy white men. And here he's talking about people who think that there's too many people on the planet. Well, I just showed you a lot of people who are obsessed with underpopulation and want to grow their population, who most likely fit in that description. You can say that I'm obsessed with overpopulation, though I would say obsessed is not the right word to analytically assess the situation of population and consumption and how it threatens our future. But I don't fit that description right there. So I think people need to really drop this, the race and the wealth and the global north, global south divide issue when we're talking at a global level that we're heading toward, different stages of collapse. We really need to start looking at ourselves as earthlings, as, a shared identity of beings on Earth that need to do everything we can to protect the Earth. So how do we reverse ecological overshoot? This is a really large task, and no one group or institution can tackle it. We just published a paper 2 weeks ago, actually challenging the UN for its pro-growth agenda and calling the UN to help us reverse ecological overshoot. And one of our statements is to correct course and reverse our advanced state of overshoot. We urge the UN to lead in contracting the large-scale variables of the human enterprise, population, economy, technosphere, and to resist co-optation by political, ideological, and special interest pressures that would derail this mandate. A lot of you are familiar with degrowth. We are big supporters of economic degrowth and the folks who have written books on it. but we feel that that's only one aspect of the human enterprise. We need to be looking at the other parts of the equation here. We focus primarily on population, at least today in my presentation, because it's the most neglected issue. This is the UN's projection for where the population currently is and could end up, if we did nothing, it could end up, at 10.3, 10.4 by the end of the century. If all of the different pronatalists that I showed you earlier had their way, it could be pushing us upwards of 15 billion. Truly, ecologically, that's not possible because we're going to see a lot of mass death and suffering before we get there. But that's their projections. And the lower projections look at what would happen if we just reduce the fertility rate by just 0.5 by putting in more autonomy enhancing policies, by giving people more freedom to choose their family size. And that could bring us to 7, or by some estimates, even 3 billion by the end of the century. We're still growing by about 80 million people a year, just as we were in 1970. So anything you hear about population collapse, just look at that as a falsehood. I don't know what media is talking about. There is no population collapse coming. And just to recognize that the population that is still growing is because over 200 million women, as far as we know, do not have access to family planning services, contraceptives, and autonomy, free from religious and family pressures to decide whether or not they want the next child. Half of all pregnancies globally are unintended. 750 million women alive today were married as children. And child marriage is still one of the leading causes of population growth. So anybody who's saying population growth, we shouldn't talk about it, well, this is the kind of stuff we are undermining. Child marriage rates are highest in regions that also have the highest fertility rates, highest population growth rates. Child labor rates are also highest in the same regions that have the highest population growth rates because of extreme poverty. So to end off here, I would just like to say that the assumption that discussing environmental concerns in the context of reproductive decision-making is somehow a cover or a subterfuge to manipulate women's decisions is paternalistic. When we say we shouldn't talk about population because whose fertility are we talking about, or, it'll lead to dangerous answers, we're actually undermining people's ability to think for themselves about what's best for them, what's best for their children, what's best for the planet. So we need to bring population back into the conversation. Here are a number of episodes we do that cover population denial, the concept of human supremacy, the concept of green growth and technological fundamentalism, really challenging those ideologies, and the concept of pronatalism and patriarchy. So at this point, I will finish off by just saying thank you, and I'm going to open the room up for questions.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Nandita. That's I really like the autonomy, not economy. We've heard so much about that transition that it just doesn't make sense. It's like so much of the economic growth argument, it's supposed to be a catch-all for everything. When you look at the specifics, it's quite a different picture. Yeah.
Yes.
What I would ask folks is if you'd like to put a question to Nandita, please try to use your hand signal and raise your hand, and I will try to find who you are and allow the question. While we're working out how to do that, I have a question. There's lots of questions, but I'll try to keep it to one. Many of us have talked about the difficulty of having climate conversations, because it can be divisive. The issue of having population conversations is obviously also needed. What suggestions would you have for how people can raise these issues with friends and families and co-workers? Because it seems to me that that's an important part of the process to be able to talk about these issues in a reasoned, sensible, sensitive way. Obviously, you've done a lot of this. What can you share in terms of how all of us can start this process?
Yes. So I think the easiest place to talk about population is to bring it back to our own personal decisions. Whether we have children or we don't have children, or we thinking about whether or not to have children, is to just bring it right back to that one aspect of our life where we make that choice, and how that choice is kind of multiplied by these billions of other people who are alive today, and asking ourselves the question, how much autonomy did I have? Do I live in a place where I'm afforded quite a bit of autonomy to decide whether or not I want children? And if I do, can I decide with whom I want to have the child, how many children I want? So that's the first question. And then say, do all people have that privilege to make that choice for themselves? And the answer is no. Overwhelmingly, people around the world do not have that privilege. In fact, most people today are born as a result of coerced reproduction, given population growth is happening in high population countries. So I think bringing it back to, number one, reproductive autonomy, having the right to choose, is one of the most important human rights, is whether or not to bring a new life. And the second aspect of the discussion should be the rights of the children that we have or that are being born, to be born into situations that are conducive to their well-being, psychologically, materially, spiritually, emotionally. We're not just looking at children as a byproduct of our desires or as commodities. They are beings with the same rights as we do. And so I think making it personal to me really helps. And then scientific facts help a lot. Climate change is directly a result of population and consumption growth. And so you can bring up the IPCC there. You're not bringing up an ideological statement, you're bringing a scientific statement, and people who don't want to talk about it are being more ideological in their discomfort. So those are my two strategies for now, but I'm sure we can unpack more.
Thank you. Yeah, it's clear that the idea that our population could increase by something like the projected 25%, and that we can deal with greenhouse gas emissions is just an insane concept. It means we would have to decrease our greenhouse gas consumptions by even more if we increase so much.
Exactly.
Okay, I see that Mathis, Otto has his hand up. Go ahead, Mathis. If you'd like to unmute yourself. Okay.
Hello, Nandita. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really speaking a lot what I'm thinking all the time. And yes, I am a white old man. But the one, like you're talking about, I mean, the emphasis I took away from that it's enabling families or the women to have the choice, and then population decline or stabilization will be happening. Now, there are some countries that you mentioned, like in Asia, Southeast Asia, well, Japan and South Korea, for instance, and even Germany, country. Pronatalism, people sort of disappear. That not the main economic driver that we sort of lived for the last 100 years almost of total capitalism, which is the narrative that's sure it comes up against people in degrowth groups in there, but not in the main discourse. So I'm just wondering how do you why can you be so optimistic that changing, giving these birth rights or the family size rights to a society will survive the capitalist mainstream?
I don't think I ever said I was optimistic, but that is definitely our proposition. I have a lot of doubts about how our economic growthist system will adapt. We have known about the aging population demographic change for 50 years. We've known that this was coming, and governments had a lot of time to prepare for having a larger cohort of older people than younger people, working people. And yet they have done nothing. So I'm not optimistic that suddenly they're going to change their mind and do something. In fact, they're going in the opposite direction, which to me sounds just completely nonsensical, is that people should start having more children now so that somehow they can support the older population. I don't know how babies can be productive. For at least 30 years, they're not going to be productive. So that argument dies very quickly. But if we were to take, challenge, like confronting capitalism and growthism seriously, then we can come up with really smart solutions for those who are willing to listen. Why do we depend on this really old idea of needing workers to support an elderly population? We have an outsized military budget. We could take a portion of that, if not all of it, to put towards Social Security. We are pouring billions of dollars trying to push women to have children through pronatalist policies. We could take those billions, put that towards safety nets for, the elderly, but also all people, for parents who need support raising children, etc. So currently our system is very much based on the commodification of human beings. Elderly are seen as burden, children are seen as, cogs for growth, workers are seen as the most productive, human capital, and we would have to shift the narrative completely away from commodification of people and nature to a narrative that's based on well-being and, really heightening the well-being of people and planet. So there are lots of options that are available, and we talk about policies in many of our papers on how to go about in doing it. But the question is, will governments do that? Will they give up that degree of power? Because again, the political power is very much tied to elite power, and elite power is very much dependent on a large labor force, cheap labor force. So there are solutions, and with a combination of all of those things, we could have a possible future. I'm not sure if we're heading that way.
Well, I would argue that it's just one thought. It's not a question, so don't have to expand on it. But I'm thinking capitalism is a bit more complicated. It's not just labor force, more people bring more goods, but it's also ratepayers and taxpayers and consumers, and somehow there's a whole machinery behind it. It's not just saying that the human life is this force. I mean, of course, we've replaced the human labor in many modern countries. You have machines and stuff that do a lot of work that people used to do, but it's still, there's an enormous pressure of that these humans create everything we have, just the whole, everything, the entertainment and so I think it's a little bit more pessimistic about success as I see it at the moment.
I'm with you.
Yeah, I mean, another aspect of this conversation is the whole issue of modern monetary theory in terms of how we pay for basic services. But that's another whole issue. I won't go there, but just to flag it as an important consideration for alternative ways of running our economy. Deirdre, you've got your hand up there. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Nandita. What a wonderful presentation. My question's about immigration. Do you have policies on immigration? Because it's going to be a dilemma as people from poor countries want to migrate to richer countries and adopt their lifestyles, and that has a huge effect. So do you think that policies on immigration are going to change, or how? Because it's generally a right-wing thing.
Right. Yeah, again, conversations about immigration get similarly, complex because of all the narratives that are associated. But if you look at immigration in the same way as you look at pronatalism, it's driven by growth. It's driven by the need for more people. It's not necessarily driven, governments aren't interested necessarily for having greater well-being of people. They're simply looking for more people. And I think both pro-immigration, like, high immigration policies, and pro-birth policies are quite similar in that people are just seen as cogs in the growth machine. So we don't take, we are a nonprofit educational organization, so we don't take positions on policy per se, but that's my, that's kind of my comment on, immigration debates get very much into, notions of nativism or racism. The left is seen as pro-immigrant, the right is seen as anti-immigrant, and then it just gets divided up. But I think the left's lack of critique on growthism being the driver of everything that's causing this, has been profound. So I think then we're left with a void because we're not challenging growth. We're left with a void where a lot of the right-wing policies will fill the void because we're too afraid to talk about any of these topics. I also think that, richer countries have an ethical responsibility, given that, at least 1 billion, if not more people this century are going to be displaced because of extreme climate change and heat exposure. We have a responsibility to actually plan for welcoming refugees, more from a place of ethics rather than a place of capitalist growth, economic growth.
And therefore would have to adjust our planned birth rate decline accordingly, make it even lower.
Yes, exactly.
Because some of the immigration is from climate and some from poverty and some from government wanting more labor, cheap labor. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I've got another questioner here next to me.
Nandita, thank you very much. And you've partly answered the question I was generating when you responded to Matthias. It's related to that idea of the transition of a society from high fertility to low fertility. And the stuff that I read about this in news services invariably treats this as a problem. It's cast as an adversity that can only be dealt with by boosting the birth rate. I sometimes think that I'd like to reply to these writers and say, this is not a problem, this is the way we need to go. But I feel as if I need to be able to say something more sensible about how a society can constructively make this transition. And I wonder if you and your colleagues have written anything about how South Korea, which is projected to halve its population by 2100, and has a fertility rate of 0.72, I think. How can it constructively make a transition?
So yes, to answer your first question, I think everybody should become an activist in terms of writing letters to the editors and op-eds, and we do a lot of that work. I'll just very quickly show you our media page to show you the kinds of things we'd have published. So The Economist, of all, published our letter to the editor, which called for the benefits of fewer people. And The Economist is one of the, beating the drum of it's too bad. Worrying population declines are a hopeful sign. Our goal should be a planet with fewer humans. How patriarchal pronatalism dominates the conversation about our future. And we talk about the military, of course, but technology won't save us. This whole thing is like, we need more innovators. We need, it's okay, we can handle more people because we'll have technology that can handle it. But the reason I'm showing this to you all is if you need inspiration or reasons, on how to write a letter to the editor, you can feel free to borrow word for word our narratives and make them your own. These narratives are based in evidence, so we always provide links, and that way we can be multiple voices, because they don't accept so many op-eds and letters to the editor from the same writers. And the second question about, how countries with declining fertility can handle the transition, I think, again, a good reminder for us is when we look at Japan and South Korea, they are always in the news that they are, population is going to collapse anytime soon. We have to remember Japan, even today, is 6 times its biocapacity to support its current population. And even if its population declines, for the next 20, 30, 40, or maybe even 50 years, it'll simply go back to where it was in the 1940s or 50s. I have a graph in one of my presentations where I show where we're always being given alarmist narratives rather than, well, it's the same population it was 50 years ago. Japan's not going to disappear. We actually need to contract and then stabilize. And, I think there's a good reason people are not having children right now. And we should be respecting those reasons because the prospects of the future are not great, either for themselves in terms of, employment opportunities, climate change, or in terms of appropriate fears that they have about bringing children into this world. So we should be embracing contraction and then heading towards a stabilization. When we get to something close to what's considered, an ecologically stable population, some people say 2 to 4 billion, where we were, 50, 60, 70 years ago, before we went into overshoot.
Okay, Pat, go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to shift the conversation slightly. I see on the wall behind your face, there is a picture with some pigs in it, maybe a mother pig and piglets, I think. So I would like to take you back to your comment earlier about human species seeing themselves as the dominant species, and the fact that now with human species are what, 64, I think, percent, and livestock are domesticated livestock are what, 30 something, and that leaves only 4% for wild animals. And I would like to ask you personally, how do you deal with that terrifying and depressing situation that we're at with regard to the human, our species, and the world?
Honestly, I live with a lot of grief for the non-human world. I'm an animal protection advocate, and yeah, it's very difficult for me to reckon with what we've done to the planet and to have, even any source of, sometimes if I find it difficult to have inspiration to do the work that we do, because there is so much violence and extermination and just, horrible things being done to these incredible beings, who have their own rights to exist, to thrive, to be with their families, to be with their communities, to experience the joy of being alive. And so I spend a lot of time, visiting animal sanctuaries or doing a rescue type of supporting rescue organizations. But it doesn't feel good to be with that, living with that knowledge. Thank you for asking.
I share your suffering, and I applaud what you are doing to help you work through it. So thank you. Your words are comforting.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Robin, I think you're next, and maybe the last question we can fit in.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nandita, for certainly a thought-provoking and interesting presentation. I may be making an even more provocative statement as a result of something I heard on the news this morning, and that was the percentage of the healthcare budget that was spent on people over 80. Now, unfortunately, I can't remember exactly what that percentage was, but it was high and certainly significant. And we talk about the number of babies coming in at one end. We don't talk about so much about what happens at the other end. And I've got myself into hot water a couple of times over this already. voluntary euthanasia is highly restricted in New Zealand. I don't know what the situation is in Canada. But I feel there also needs to be a discussion on perhaps voluntary restriction of care to comfort-only measures for people, and for that to be seen as a valid choice, if you like. Yeah, as I say, a difficult discussion as well. So
yeah,
I'd be interested if you've thought about it at all or discussed it.
I think in my personal conversations, I do talk about it at our work level. We don't talk about it because most people think, anybody who's talking about population is planning some kind of a culling scheme. And so we just stay away from that. But when it comes to, when we talk about autonomy, for me, I'm in Canada, I'm very lucky to live in Canada where we do have assisted euthanasia available for people. And it's something I would want to have access to when I feel it's time for me. And I agree with you that, if we are really respecting people's autonomy, then it should be about quality of life, not just, quantity. And so we don't take a position, but, it's something that deeply interests me. It's a conversation that I'm, thinking about for myself too. So I want to say I appreciate that you are doing the hard talking about this subject. And I can see, why, it's again, a product of industrialization, a modern industrial techno society that has allowed us to surpass a lot of things that are not normal for our species, extend our life, extend medical care, extend all sorts of things, do, medical intervention to ourselves that a lot of other species don't have access to, and they are limited by natural limits like we were for majority of our history. So I think as, there's a great book title called Hospicing Modernity. So, as we hospice modernity, I feel like some of those interventions are also going to naturally leave us. And we're going to probably become more a part of nature than we have been for the last few hundred thousands of years.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Peter Whitmore, you seem to have your hand up there. Would you want to have a quick question? We don't have much time up.
Shukriya, Nandita. Yeah, I've been really concerned about this because the population has grown. It's tripled since, I'm 80 years old and the population has more than tripled in those 80 years. And it doesn't seem to be anything that gets talked about in the media much or anything like that. And so it's really good to hear you talking about it and giving a really good presentation about it. But are there any, simple things that we can do to try and get this thing more into the public? We could write letters to the paper, but are there any other things we can do to try and get this issue more into the public notice?
I'm going to make a selfish recommendation, but I think it's a strategic one too, is we do a lot of hard work in interviewing top researchers and scientists on our podcast. And we, the talk that I did today, every aspect of things I talked about, we talked for an hour, one aspect of it with a researcher. So I think if you could help push people to our podcast so they can actually understand different aspects of the issues, whatever they are interested in, we've touched it. So I think that could be a really big boost for not just personally our nonprofit work. I'm not trying to grow our nonprofit, but for the message to get out there. we're doing the hard work. So if you can help get it out there, we would appreciate it. Other than that, feel free to go through some of our writing and some of the work we've done and use that to, you know, push out your own conversations with family and friends. If somebody accuses you of, you know, being whatever pejorative you want to insert that people with population, you know, advocacy are leveled at, you can just say, hey, listen to these people. They have old white guys, you know, as advisors. William Rees is one of my favorite old white guys. I have a lot of my mentors are these people. And so I really think the identity politics causes us more harm than good. And so we need to move beyond those. So yes, please feel free to borrow anything you find helpful and pass it on as your own.
Yeah, it's really the population balance website is a wonderful resource, and I really do encourage everyone to have a look. And the other thing that I would suggest, in addition to speaking to family and friends, is to be prepared for pushback. Be prepared for people to get upset and sensitive, and think about how to handle that in a sensitive and supportive way, because it's highly likely that that's what will happen. So don't be surprised or shocked by it, but regard it as making progress. So I would encourage, and if you need support, you know, again, go to the website, Nandita's website, and find ways of speaking about this that are science-based and values-based and sensitive. Meg, I'm afraid I'm not going to have time. We're not going to have time to give you another opportunity here, just to be cognizant of everyone's time. So on behalf of everyone, Nandita, thanks again for your very comprehensive and sensitive portrayal and discussion of these very difficult issues. And you're a real inspiration for all of us to deal with this very difficult but very, very important issue.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And we'll end with another karakia from Beverly when she unmutes herself.
In the meantime, I've put my email address. If anybody, Meg and any others who didn't get to talk today, if you'd like to email me and, you know, have another call, Zoom call or email exchange, please reach out. It's always so nice to have other people in the network who believe in this stuff. So thank you.
Thank you. I just had a question about the recording. You've recorded this. If we want to put some onto the recording, where do we access it?
Yeah, well, populationbalance.org, I think, is your...
The recording.
Yep.
Go on the OCD website.
Yeah, go to the Our Climate Declaration website. It should be up in a few days. Okay, Our Climate Declaration website. And it'll be on some other NGO websites as well. But go ahead, Bev, and give us our final karakia.
I chose one that I didn't know if it would fit, but according to the way the conversation is going and the challenges you've put out for us, Nandita, it is perfectly sensible. Tu fitia te hopo, mai rangatia te angitu. Feel the fear and do it anyway.
That's really great. Thank you.
Thanks again, Nandita. And thanks to all of those that participated, and keep up the good work, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.